Everyone's been stuck with an unexpectedly expensive restaurant bill, but most people just pay it and complain later. These people, however, turned avoiding payment into an art form that would make con artists everywhere weep with embarrassment. From elaborate theater productions to bizarre medical emergencies, here are the most spectacularly failed attempts to dine and dash without the dashing. 1. I'm a food blogger with 50,000 followers, announced Jessica to the skeptical manager, pulling up her Instagram account with 47 followers and 3 photos of her lunch. She'd ordered the most expensive items on the menu, taken professional quality photos with her phone, and expected a comped meal in exchange for exposure. Her food blogging empire consisted of posting pictures of sandwiches with captions like "Yum," but she remained convinced that social media influence was legal currency. When the manager politely declined her collaboration offer, Jessica escalated to demanding the corporate number to report discrimination against content creators. She spent 20 minutes explaining her influencer marketing strategy to increasingly confused staff, while her boyfriend sat mortified at their table. Her final threat involved posting a negative review that would destroy their business, despite having no actual followers to see it. The manager eventually offered her a 10% discount just to make her leave, which Jessica accepted while claiming victory for her negotiation skills. 2. The hair appeared in Marcus's salad exactly 30 seconds after he'd finished eating everything else on his plate. His performance included dramatic gagging, demands to speak with the manager, and threats to call the health department about the disgusting contamination that had somehow materialized after he'd consumed 3 courses and 2 desserts. Security footage later revealed Marcus discreetly planting his own hair while pretending to reach for his napkin. 3. This pasta is giving me Vietnam flashbacks, declared Robert, a 23-year-old who'd never served in any military and had listed his occupation as influencer on his dating profile. His PTSD performance included trembling hands, distant stares, and elaborate stories about imaginary combat trauma triggered by marinara sauce. His act fell apart when he couldn't remember which war he'd supposedly fought in and kept mixing up military terminology he'd learned from video games. 4. Sarah's elaborate allergy attack began precisely when the check arrived, complete with fake hives she'd drawn on her arms with red lipstick and Oscar-worthy gasping about her sudden inability to breathe. Her medical emergency performance demanded immediate transportation to the hospital, but mysteriously resolved the moment staff offered to call an ambulance. Her life-threatening reaction to food she'd already finished eating became less convincing when servers noticed her lipstick was the same shade as her allergic reaction. 5. My grandfather built this restaurant in 1952, announced elderly Frank to the 19-year-old hostess, producing fake documents that claimed ownership of the establishment his family had supposedly operated for decades. His inheritance story included detailed family history about the restaurant's founding, despite the fact that the building had been constructed in 1987, and Frank was clearly reading his story from notes written on napkins. 6. The fake phone call performance began when Linda answered her obviously silent phone and began having an animated conversation with her lawyer about discrimination lawsuits and civil rights violations. Her legal theater included references to imaginary laws she'd invented, threats about media coverage, and demands to speak with corporate headquarters about the illegal treatment she'd received by being asked to pay for food she'd ordered and consumed. Linda's conversation became increasingly dramatic as she described constitutional violations and human rights abuses to her silent phone, occasionally putting the call on speaker so restaurant staff could hear the non-existent lawyer's advice. Her performance included fake legal terminology she'd clearly learned from courtroom TV shows and threats about taking this all the way to the Supreme Court for the injustice of being charged money for restaurant meals. When staff offered to wait while she finished her call, Linda panicked and claimed her lawyer had to hang up for an emergency court hearing, but would be calling back within minutes to speak directly with management. She sat at her table for another hour, occasionally answering her silent phone and having brief conversations with her legal team about the progress of her case, before finally admitting her phone battery had died and she couldn't reach her lawyer anymore. 7. I ate here last week and got terrible food poisoning, claimed Kevin, whose story fell apart when staff checked their records and discovered the restaurant had been closed for renovations the entire previous week. His food safety complaint included detailed descriptions of symptoms he'd allegedly experienced from meals served during dates when the kitchen wasn't operating. But Kevin remained convinced his timeline was accurate despite photographic evidence to the contrary. 8. Michelle's religious exemption request claimed that paying for food violated her spiritual beliefs and that charging money for sustenance was against her constitutional right to free meals. Her theological argument included citations from religious texts she'd clearly never read and references to constitutional amendments that didn't exist. Her spiritual dietary freedom case became less convincing when she couldn't name her religion or explain why her beliefs only applied to restaurant bills and not grocery stores. 9. The music was too loud and traumatized my service dog, explained David, pointing to his clearly untrained golden retriever wearing a vest he'd purchased online. His service animal claim included demands for accommodation and threats about disability discrimination, despite his service dog having no training, certification, or apparent purpose beyond providing emotional support for avoiding restaurant bills. 10. The celebrity impersonation began when Janet claimed to be the mayor's daughter and demanded the family discount she'd supposedly received at every restaurant in town. Her political connection story included references to city officials she'd obviously Googled 5 minutes earlier, and threats about negative publicity for businesses that didn't honor her imaginary family status. Her mayoral heritage became questionable when she couldn't name the mayor or explain why the mayor's daughter would need discounts at restaurants. 11. This food is clearly expired, announced Gary after finishing his entire meal and most of his wife's dinner, claiming his refined palate had detected spoilage that wasn't apparent until after consumption. His food safety expertise included technical terminology he'd learned from Google searches and threats about health department investigations for serving obviously contaminated meals that he'd somehow managed to eat completely before noticing any problems. 12. The medical emergency card appeared when elderly Doris claimed her pacemaker was malfunctioning due to the restaurant's Wi-Fi signals, demanding immediate medical attention and threatening lawsuits about electromagnetic interference. Her cardiac crisis included dramatic chest clutching and demands that staff turn off all electronic devices to prevent her heart device failure, but mysteriously resolved when servers offered to call emergency medical services. Doris's electromagnetic sensitivity story included detailed explanations about how wireless internet was disrupting her medical implant, despite having used her smartphone to check Facebook multiple times during dinner. Her performance escalated when she demanded that other customers also turn off their phones to prevent her cardiac emergency, creating a restaurant-wide electronic shutdown that confused other diners. When the manager offered to call 911, Doris suddenly remembered that her cardiologist had given her special medication for Wi-Fi sensitivity that she could take in the bathroom, disappearing for 15 minutes before returning completely recovered. Her medical miracle coincided perfectly with her realization that ambulance rides were expensive and would require her to provide real medical information to actual healthcare professionals. She attempted to negotiate a medical emergency discount for her traumatic dining experience, but settled for paying half her bill to avoid further medical intervention. 13. I'm lactose intolerant, and you didn't warn me about dairy, claimed Steve after ordering and consuming a cheese pizza, chocolate milkshake, and ice cream sundae. His dietary restriction revelation included threats about allergen disclosure violations and demands for compensation for his preventable suffering, despite having specifically requested extra cheese on his pizza and asking for whipped cream on his dessert. 14. The time travel excuse came from Patricia, who claimed the restaurant's clocks were wrong and that she'd arrived after closing time, making her meal technically after-hours dining that shouldn't be charged to customers. Her temporal argument included references to atomic clock accuracy and demands that management prove their timekeeping was synchronized with official time standards before charging for meals served during disputed time periods. 15. "I'm a secret shopper for the corporate office," announced mysterious Tony, producing a badge he'd clearly made at home and claiming his meal was part of an official quality assessment that exempted him from payment. His corporate investigation story included references to evaluation criteria he'd invented and threats about negative reports to headquarters if staff didn't cooperate with his official business dining evaluation. 16. The emotional support excuse came from Karen, who claimed her meal was therapeutic dining, prescribed by her doctor for anxiety treatment, making it a medical expense that restaurants were legally required to provide free under healthcare accessibility laws she'd invented. Her medical meal argument included fake doctor's notes she'd written herself, and references to imaginary legislation about therapeutic food access rights. 17. This restaurant gave me diarrhea 3 years ago, claimed Brenda, whose food poisoning timeline didn't explain why she'd returned to eat at an establishment that had supposedly made her sick years earlier. Her historical illness story included medical details she'd researched online and demands for compensation for long-term digestive trauma from previous visits that couldn't be verified and didn't explain her current dining choices. 18. The alien abduction defense came from eccentric Harold, who claimed extraterrestrials had erased his memory of ordering food and that he couldn't be held responsible for meals he didn't remember requesting. His UFO encounter story included detailed descriptions of his abduction experience and arguments that alien mind control made him legally incompetent to enter into dining contracts with Earth-based restaurants. Harold's extraterrestrial explanation featured precise details about the spacecraft's interior design, the alien's appearance, and the memory-wiping procedure they'd performed while he was unconscious in their ship. His abduction timeline conveniently occurred during the exact period when he'd been sitting in the restaurant ordering food, and he claimed the aliens had implanted false memories of enjoying his meal to cover up their experimental procedures. Harold produced drawings of the alien beings on napkins and offered to submit to lie detector tests to prove his encounter, while demanding that the restaurant contact government authorities to verify his extraterrestrial experience. His space visitor defense included references to Area 51, government cover-ups, and international treaties about alien-human contact protocols that supposedly exempted abduction victims from financial obligations incurred during memory manipulation. When staff remained skeptical, Harold claimed the aliens were still monitoring him through satellite technology, and that forcing him to pay could trigger another abduction event right there in the restaurant. 19. My identical twin ate here and already paid, explained Susan, whose twin sister story fell apart when staff pointed out that identical twins don't typically wear completely different clothes and have different credit cards. Her sibling payment argument included claims about shared family meal accounts and confusion about which twin was responsible for which dining expenses, despite being obviously the same person who'd eaten there alone. 20. The witness protection excuse came from dramatic Edward, who claimed federal agents had confiscated his wallet as part of his relocation to a new identity, making payment impossible until his new documentation arrived from government agencies. His federal protection story included references to classified operations and threats about exposing restaurant staff to dangerous criminals if they forced him to reveal his identity by providing payment information. 21. I'm testing your customer service for Yelp, announced Modern Martha, claiming her meal was part of an official review process that required complimentary dining to ensure unbiased evaluation. Her review authenticity argument included references to journalistic integrity and claims that paying for meals would compromise her ability to provide honest assessments to potential customers who relied on objective restaurant reviews. 22. The currency confusion came from Worldly William, who claimed the prices were listed in foreign money and that he'd assumed the meal cost significantly less when converted to American dollars. His international exchange argument included calculations he'd performed incorrectly and demands that restaurants honor the exchange rates he'd invented rather than the actual prices clearly listed in US dollars on English-language menus. 23. My psychic predicted I'd receive a free meal today, explained mystical Rachel, whose spiritual dining prophecy included detailed descriptions of her fortune teller's visions and claims that refusing to honor psychic predictions would result in bad karma for the restaurant. Her supernatural payment exemption argument included threats about cosmic justice and warnings that charging her would anger spiritual forces beyond the restaurant's control. 24. The environmental protest came from activist Angela, who claimed paying for meals supported capitalist food systems that were destroying the planet, making her refusal to pay an act of ecological civil disobedience. Her environmental justice argument included lectures about sustainable dining and demands that restaurants demonstrate their environmental commitment by providing free meals to protesters fighting climate change through non-payment. 25. I'm pregnant and craving this food for my baby's health, claimed obviously non-pregnant Denise, whose maternal nutrition argument included references to prenatal dietary requirements and threats about endangering fetal development by denying expectant mothers access to necessary food. Her pregnancy excuse became less convincing when staff noticed her baby bump appeared to be a sweater stuffed under her shirt. 26. The government agent story came from official-looking Charles, who claimed his meal was part of a federal investigation into restaurant tax compliance, and that payment would compromise his undercover operation. His law enforcement cover story included fake badges he'd ordered online and threats about obstructing federal investigations if staff insisted on normal payment procedures for his official government dining. Charles's federal agent performance featured detailed explanations about his surveillance mission, complete with radio communication using earpiece equipment he'd purchased from a spy store, and official-sounding code words he'd invented for his operation. His investigation story included claims about monitoring the restaurant's financial practices, observing staff behavior for federal compliance, and gathering evidence for a larger case involving restaurant industry taxation policies. Charles produced laminated credentials with official-looking seals and warned staff that his identity was classified information that couldn't be verified through normal channels without compromising national security operations. His undercover dining mission supposedly required him to blend in as a normal customer, which explained why he'd ordered expensive items and seemed to enjoy his meal thoroughly. When the manager offered to call the FBI field office to verify his credentials, Charles claimed his operation was so secret that even other federal agents weren't aware of his assignment, and that any contact with law enforcement would blow his cover and endanger ongoing investigations. His federal dining operation included taking photos of the restaurant's interior for evidence and requesting receipt copies for his official report to government supervisors who needed documentation of his investigative expenses. 27. This meal doesn't meet my dietary restrictions, claimed vegan Veronica after consuming an entire steak dinner, claiming her plant-based lifestyle had been violated by misleading menu descriptions. Her dietary violation argument included demands for compensation for forced consumption of animal products, despite having specifically ordered meat dishes and expressed satisfaction with her meal until the check arrived. 28. The academic research excuse came from scholarly Samuel, who claimed his dining experience was part of a university study on restaurant economics that required free meals to maintain research integrity. His educational exemption argument included references to institutional review boards and claims that paying for meals would invalidate his research data about consumer dining behavior and restaurant service quality. 29. I'm a food safety inspector and this is an official visit, announced uniformed Patricia, wearing a vest she'd purchased online and carrying a clipboard with fake forms she'd printed at home. Her regulatory inspection story included threats about health code violations and claims that inspector meals were provided free as part of official evaluation procedures, despite her obvious lack of actual authority or credentials. 30. The lottery winner excuse came from newly wealthy Walter, who claimed his recent jackpot winnings were tied up in legal proceedings that prevented him from accessing funds for restaurant payments. His millionaire cash flow problem included detailed stories about lottery commissions and bank transfers, but became less convincing when staff noticed his winning ticket was clearly a gas station receipt he'd modified with a pen. 31. My meal was contaminated with gluten, claimed celiac Catherine, after finishing a pasta dinner she'd specifically requested, including extra bread and dessert items that were obviously wheat-based. Her gluten sensitivity revelation included threats about cross-contamination lawsuits and demands for compensation for her accidental poisoning, despite having deliberately ordered items that any celiac patient would know to avoid. 32. The diplomatic immunity claim came from International Ivan, who produced a passport from a country that didn't exist and claimed embassy protection from local payment requirements. His foreign diplomat story included references to international law and threats about diplomatic incidents if restaurant staff violated his imaginary sovereign immunity from commercial transactions during his official cultural exchange visit. 33. This restaurant is haunted, and the ghost told me not to pay, explained Supernatural Sandra, whose paranormal dining experience included claims about spiritual communications and warnings that payment would anger restless spirits. Her ghostly exemption argument included threats about paranormal retaliation against restaurants that ignored spectral advice and demands that staff respect the wishes of deceased former customers who opposed current pricing policies. 34. The military discount request came from veteran Victor, whose service record became questionable when he couldn't remember which branch he'd served in and kept mixing up basic military terminology. His combat story included references to wars that occurred before his birth and claims about special forces operations that were obviously borrowed from action movies he'd watched recently. 35. I'm a professional food critic for a major publication, claimed critic Christina, whose journalism credentials consisted of a blog with no readers and business cards she'd printed at home. Her media coverage argument included threats about negative reviews and claims that critic meals were traditionally complimentary, despite her obvious lack of affiliation with any actual publication or food service organization. Christina's food critic performance featured a professional notebook, where she'd been taking detailed notes about her dining experience, complete with descriptions of flavor profiles, presentation analysis, and service quality assessments that seemed legitimate until staff noticed she was writing in crayon. Her journalistic credentials included business cards identifying her as senior food editor for publications that sounded official but didn't exist, and she carried a camera with professional-looking equipment that was actually a toy she'd purchased at a dollar store. Christina's review process included interviewing other customers about their dining experiences, taking photos of every course from multiple angles, and requesting to speak with the chef about ingredients and preparation methods for her comprehensive restaurant profile. Her media empire extended to claims about television appearances and radio interviews she'd supposedly given about restaurant trends, complete with fake press clippings she'd created on her home computer. When staff remained skeptical about her credentials, Christina offered to provide her editor's contact information, producing a phone number that led to her own voicemail message recorded in a fake British accent, claiming to be away on assignment in Paris. Her professional food criticism career included demands for detailed ingredient lists to check for potential allergic reactions, special seating arrangements for optimal photography lighting, and advance notice about any menu changes that might affect her review timeline. 36. The class action lawsuit excuse came from litigious Larry, who claimed his meal was part of an ongoing legal case against the restaurant chain, and that payment would constitute admission of guilt in federal court proceedings. His legal involvement story included references to imaginary lawsuits and threats about witness tampering if staff forced him to pay for meals during active litigation he'd invented. 37. My phone was hacked, and someone else placed this order, explained Technological Teresa, whose cybersecurity excuse included claims about identity theft and demands that restaurants verify customer authorization before serving meals. Her digital security argument became less convincing when staff pointed out that she'd been physically present, ordering in person, and eating the food herself rather than receiving fraudulent delivery orders. 38. The charitable donation angle came from philanthropic Paul, who claimed his meal consumption was actually a donation to help restaurants during difficult economic times, and that payment would constitute double charging for his generous support. His economic assistance argument included references to small business relief and claims that wealthy customers like himself were providing vital financial aid through strategic non-payment. 39. I'm conducting a social experiment on class privilege, announced academic Anna, whose sociology research supposedly required testing whether restaurants treated customers differently based on their ability to pay. Her educational project argument included references to university ethics boards and claims that paying for meals would invalidate her research data about economic discrimination in food service industries. Anna's social experiment featured detailed explanations about her academic methodology, complete with consent forms she'd created for restaurant staff to sign, acknowledging their participation in her study about socioeconomic bias in dining establishments. Her research project included claims about publishing her findings in academic journals and presenting her data at sociology conferences, with the restaurant serving as a crucial case study for her dissertation on economic inequality in consumer service interactions. Anna produced fake university identification and research permits that looked official, but contained obvious errors like misspelled institution names and expiration dates from the previous decade. Her experimental design required her to observe staff reactions to customers who couldn't pay their bills, making her non-payment an essential component of legitimate scientific research that would benefit society's understanding of class discrimination. When staff offered to accommodate her research by providing a discounted meal in exchange for a proper study protocol, Anna claimed that any special treatment would compromise her data integrity, and that authentic results required her to experience genuine financial hardship scenarios. Her academic experiment included taking notes on staff behavior, recording reaction times to her payment difficulties, and documenting the restaurant's policies regarding customers experiencing economic difficulties, all while insisting that her methodology required absolute authenticity in her role as a financially distressed diner. 40. Yes, why? The insurance claim came from accident-prone Albert, who claimed his meal was covered under his health insurance policy as treatment for a medical condition that required specific dietary therapy. His medical nutrition argument included fake doctor's orders and claims that restaurants were required to bill insurance companies directly, rather than charging patients for therapeutic dining experiences prescribed by healthcare providers. 41. This food caused an immediate allergic reaction, claimed reactive Rita after consuming every item on her plate and ordering additional dessert, suddenly developing symptoms that required emergency medical attention and compensation for her suffering. Her allergy timeline became questionable when staff noticed her severe reaction had somehow allowed her to finish eating before becoming life-threatening. 42. The corporate expense account excuse came from business-minded Bob, who claimed his meal was a company dinner that would be reimbursed by his employer's accounting department and that restaurants should bill his corporation directly. His expense report story included references to corporate policies and fake employee identification, but became less convincing when he couldn't name his company or explain why business meals required personal dining at restaurants. 43. I'm a time traveler from the future where money doesn't exist, explained futuristic Frank, whose temporal displacement story included warnings about anachronistic payment systems and claims that future societies had evolved beyond monetary transactions. His science fiction excuse included detailed explanations about post-scarcity economics and threats that forcing time travelers to use primitive currency could disrupt the timeline. 44. The religious pilgrimage argument came from Spiritual Steve, who claimed his meal was part of a sacred journey that required charitable feeding of travelers and that charging pilgrims violated religious freedom laws. His holy exemption story included references to ancient hospitality traditions and threats about religious discrimination against customers seeking spiritual nourishment during their religious observances. 45. And finally, there's Margaret, who attempted the most elaborate restaurant scam in recorded history by claiming she was actually a secret undercover inspector for a reality TV show that was filming the restaurant's response to non-paying customers. Her television production story included fake crew members she'd hired from a temp agency, hidden cameras that were actually broken phones, and contracts she'd forged on official-looking letterhead she'd designed herself. Margaret's media empire included detailed explanations about television production and threats about negative publicity if staff didn't cooperate with her show. Her elaborate performance lasted 3 hours and involved multiple costume changes, fake phone calls with producers, and increasingly dramatic revelations about the restaurant's test that would determine their eligibility for positive television coverage. The scheme collapsed when her hired crew members admitted they'd been paid $20 each to stand around looking important, while Margaret performed her television inspector routine. Her reality show turned out to be entirely fictional. Her production company existed only in her imagination, and her hidden cameras were recording nothing except her own elaborate performance for an audience of confused restaurant staff who'd spent the evening wondering if they were being pranked or witnessing someone's complete break from reality. Here's the brutal truth about trying to scam restaurants. Servers have seen every trick, managers have heard every excuse, and security cameras capture every performance. These people discovered that creativity applied to avoiding payment just makes your inevitable humiliation more elaborate and public. The real tragedy? Most of these scam attempts cost more time, energy, and dignity than just paying the original bill would have required. Want to avoid paying restaurant bills? Cook at home. Want to eat out? Bring money. It's a shockingly simple system that has worked for thousands of years. Subscribe if you prefer paying for your food like a normal human being instead of becoming a cautionary tale about dining and scamming.